6 months ago, my own family didn't invite me to my cousin's wedding because they said I was an embarrassment to the family name. Last Saturday, that same wedding almost got canceled when the officiant asked if the bride had permission from the property owner, and everyone's heads turned to look at me. Here's how the family black sheep became the person who literally owned the ground they were all standing on. My name is Sarah Chen, and for the past 8 years, my family has treated me like I'm some kind of charity case. You know that one relative everyone whispers about at family gatherings, the one who never quite figured it out and makes everyone else uncomfortable just by existing? That was me. The veteran who came back from 2 tours in Afghanistan and couldn't seem to get her life together according to my family's very specific definition of success. My younger sister Emma runs a successful marketing agency in downtown Seattle. My brother David just made partner at his law firm. My cousin Jessica, the bride-to-be, works as a pharmaceutical sales rep and pulls in 6 figures annually. And then there's me, living in what they call some run-down apartment, driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic and working what they assumed were odd jobs to make ends meet. The wedding invitations went out 3 months ago. Cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering, addressed to every family member except one. I found out about my exclusion the way most family secrets eventually surface, through my grandmother's accidentally honest phone call. "Sarah, honey, I feel terrible about this," Grandma Rose said, her voice wavering with that particular guilt that comes from being caught in the middle of family drama. "Your Aunt Patricia says they just don't have room for everyone. But between you and me, I think it's because they're worried about appearances." Appearances. That word has followed me around like a shadow since I got back from my second deployment. Apparently, showing up to family events in jeans and a simple t-shirt instead of designer clothes signals to everyone that you're not worth including in the important moments. Apparently, living quietly and keeping to yourself means you're antisocial and embarrassing. Apparently, not talking about your work means you don't have any real work to talk about. "It's okay, Grandma," I told her, even though it wasn't. "I understand." But I didn't understand. Not really. What I understood was that my family had created a version of me in their minds. The struggling veteran, the family disappointment, the one who couldn't transition back to civilian life properly, and they'd become so attached to that story that they'd stopped seeing who I actually was. The truth is, I stopped trying to correct their assumptions about 2 years ago. Every time I'd attempt to share something positive about my life, it would either get dismissed or turned into a lecture about how I needed to think bigger or be more ambitious. When I mentioned that I was doing well, my Aunt Patricia would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Well, as long as you're happy with small victories, that's what matters." When I'd show up to family dinners without complaining about money, my Uncle Frank would make jokes about how I must have found a sugar daddy to support my simple lifestyle. So I learned to smile and nod. I learned to let them believe what they wanted to believe. It was easier than fighting their preconceptions, and honestly, I had more important things to focus on than managing my family's opinions about my life choices. The wedding was planned for Riverside Gardens, this beautiful estate property about an hour outside the city. Jessica had been gushing about it for months, how exclusive it was, how she'd had to book it 2 years in advance, how it was going to be the perfect fairy tale setting for her special day. The ceremony would be held in the Rose Garden overlooking the river, with the reception in the restored Victorian mansion. She'd shown me pictures on her phone during one of the few family gatherings I'd attended, scrolling through images of manicured lawns, elegant architecture, and sweeping views of the water. "It's expensive," she'd confided, "but Marcus and I decided we only get married once, so we might as well do it right. The venue fee alone is more than most people's annual salary, but the exclusivity is worth it. You literally can't get married there unless you meet their standards." I'd nodded appropriately and made the right appreciative sounds, but something about the property had seemed familiar. The stone archway in the photos, the particular way the mansion's tower caught the afternoon light, the distinctive curved bridge over the small creek that ran through the grounds. I couldn't quite place where I'd seen it before, but it nagged at me like a song you can't quite remember. When Grandma Rose called to awkwardly explain my exclusion from the wedding, she mentioned they were having some last-minute concerns about the venue. "Your cousin is stressed out of her mind," she said. "Apparently there's some confusion about permits and property ownership. The venue coordinator has been asking for documentation that Jessica thought was already handled. Something about needing explicit permission from the actual property owner, not just the management company." That's when it clicked. The familiar stone archway, the distinctive bridge, the way the afternoon light hit the mansion's tower. I knew exactly where I'd seen those details before, because I'd been looking at them through my own windows for the past 3 years. Riverside Gardens wasn't just some exclusive wedding venue that Jessica had booked, it was my property. The Victorian mansion she'd been dreaming about? I'd been restoring it room by room since I bought the entire estate in 2021. The rose garden where she planned to say her vows? I'd spent last summer replanting it after the previous owners had let it go to seed. The exclusivity she'd bragged about? That was because I only rented it out for special events to help offset the restoration costs, and I personally approved every booking. The management company Jessica had been working with was Cascade Event Solutions, a small firm I'd hired to handle the booking logistics so I wouldn't have to deal with bridezillas and demanding clients directly. I'd explicitly told them that I preferred to remain anonymous as the property owner, partly for privacy and partly because I'd learned that people treated you differently when they knew you owned something they wanted to use. Jessica had been planning her dream wedding on my property for 8 months, while simultaneously excluding me from that same wedding because I wasn't successful enough to deserve an invitation. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt like the universe had a sense of humor. But here's the thing that really got to me. It wasn't just about the venue. Over the past few months, as Jessica dealt with various wedding planning challenges, I'd watched my family rally around her in ways they'd never rallied around me. When she needed help with vendor negotiations, my brother David offered his legal expertise. When she was stressed about catering costs, my parents quietly helped cover the difference. When she couldn't decide between photographers, the entire extended family spent a Sunday afternoon looking through portfolios and offering opinions. Meanwhile, I'd been sitting in my rundown apartment, which was actually the beautifully restored caretaker's cottage on the estate grounds, listening to them discuss how worried they were about Jessica's wedding stress, knowing that I could solve most of her problems with a single phone call to my event coordinator. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in my cottage and looked out at the preparations happening on my own property. Florists were arranging white roses along the garden paths I'd personally designed. Caterers were setting up tables on the lawn I'd had professionally landscaped. A string quartet was sound-checking on the stone patio I'd had restored by master craftsmen. My family was gathering for the most important celebration of the year, 50 yards from my front door, and I was the only person not invited. That's when I decided that maybe it was time for some truth to come to light. Not out of spite or revenge, but because I was tired of being invisible in my own life. I was tired of watching people I loved celebrate milestones while treating me like an afterthought. I was tired of being seen as less than I was, simply because I'd chosen to live quietly rather than loudly. So I put on my best dress, not the jeans and t-shirt my family expected, but an elegant navy blue outfit I'd been saving for special occasions, and I walked out of my cottage, across my gardens, and toward the ceremony that was about to begin on my property. It was time for my family to meet the real Sarah Chen. The morning air was crisp with that particular September clarity that makes everything look like it's been painted in watercolors. I could hear the gentle murmur of voices carrying across the estate grounds as the wedding party and early guests began to arrive. From my cottage window, I watched the familiar choreography of a family gathering unfold. The same dynamics that had played out at every major event for the past 8 years. just with more expensive clothes and professional photographers. My Aunt Patricia stepped out of a black Mercedes SUV, immediately taking charge of directing traffic in the makeshift parking area we'd created in the lower meadow. She wore a champagne-colored, mother-of-the-bride dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she moved with the authority of someone who believed the world naturally bent to her expectations. Patricia had always been the family matriarch, the one who decided who belonged where and when, and she'd made her feelings about my place in the family hierarchy crystal clear over the years. No, park over there," she called to my uncle, Frank, waving him toward a spot farther from the main house. "The immediate family needs to be closest to the entrance." Her voice carried that particular tone of exasperation she reserved for people who couldn't read her mind about proper protocol. Uncle Frank grumbled something under his breath, but obediently moved his car. He'd driven up from Portland with his wife Linda and their twin daughters, both of whom were serving as bridesmaids. Frank owned a successful chain of hardware stores throughout Oregon and Washington, and he never let anyone forget it. At family gatherings, he had a way of turning every conversation back to business growth strategies and profit margins, as if the rest of us couldn't possibly understand the complexities of real success. My parents arrived next, in their pristine, silver Lexus that my father washed every Sunday without fail. Dad stepped out first, adjusting his tie with the careful precision of someone who'd spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder at Boeing. Mom emerged from the passenger side, wearing a floral dress I recognized from the Nordstrom catalog. She'd shown it to me 3 months ago, asking if I thought it was appropriate for a garden wedding. I'd told her it was perfect, though she'd seemed surprised that I had an opinion about fashion at all. They both paused to survey the estate, their expressions, mixing appreciation with something that looked almost like confusion. Mom shielded her eyes against the morning sun as she gazed up at the mansion's restored Victorian architecture, its cream-colored walls and burgundy trim gleaming fresh and elegant against the blue sky. Patricia wasn't kidding about this place. "Being spectacular," Mom said to Dad, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "Jessica really outdid herself finding this venue. I can't imagine what something like this costs to rent." Dad nodded, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "Must be family money behind a property like this. You don't maintain grounds like these without serious resources." He gestured toward the perfectly manicured gardens, the restored stone pathways, and the small fleet of groundskeeping equipment I kept discreetly housed in the renovated barn. What they didn't know was that every single detail they were admiring, from the heritage roses that lined the garden paths to the hand-carved wooden benches positioned at scenic overlooks throughout the property, represented years of my own careful planning and investment. The grounds they were marveling at existed because I'd spent countless weekends learning about horticulture, consulting with landscape architects, and getting my hands dirty planting, pruning, and maintaining everything they saw. My brother David arrived with his wife Amanda and their 8-year-old son Tyler. David wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, tailored in that expensive way that whispers rather than shouts about cost. He'd always been the golden child, the one who'd followed the prescribed path from college to law school to partnership track without any detours or complications. His success was the kind the family understood: prestigious, visible, quantifiable. Amanda stepped carefully across the gravel parking area in her designer heels, holding Tyler's hand while scanning the property with the appreciative eye of someone who recognized quality when she saw it. She worked as an interior designer for high-end residential clients, so she understood the level of craftsmanship and investment that went into maintaining a historical property like this one. "This is incredible," she said to David, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "Look at the attention to detail in the restoration work. Someone put serious money and expertise into bringing this place back to life. The original woodwork on the mansion looks completely authentic to the period." She was right, of course. I'd hired master craftsmen who specialized in Victorian-era restoration, and we'd spent 2 years sourcing period-appropriate materials and techniques to ensure every detail was historically accurate. The window frames had been restored using traditional methods, the wraparound porch had been rebuilt with reclaimed heart pine, and the decorative millwork had been painstakingly repaired by artisans who understood the original craftsmanship. Tyler immediately broke free from his parents and ran toward the small creek that meandered through the property, drawn by the sound of water flowing over the stones. The creek had been one of my favorite discoveries when I'd first toured the property, and I'd worked with environmental specialists to restore its natural flow patterns and enhance the wildlife habitat along its banks. "Tyler, stay where we can. See you," David called after his son, but his attention was already shifting to the logistics of the day. He pulled out his phone and started making notes, falling naturally into the role of family coordinator that he'd occupied since childhood. David had a way of taking charge that felt both helpful and slightly controlling, as if he couldn't quite trust that things would work out properly without his oversight. My sister Emma made her entrance in typical Emma fashion, stepping out of a bright red Tesla wearing a stunning emerald green dress that photographed beautifully against the natural backdrop. She immediately started taking pictures, not just casual snapshots, but carefully composed shots that would look perfect on her social media feeds. Emma had built her marketing agency partly on her ability to create compelling visual content, and she approached every event as an opportunity to showcase her aesthetic sensibilities. "This lighting is absolutely magical," she announced to anyone within earshot, holding her phone at various angles to capture the way the morning sun filtered through the old oak trees. "Jessica really knows how to pick a venue. This place is going to photograph like a dream." She was right about the lighting. I'd spent months studying the way natural light moved across the property throughout the day, and I'd strategically positioned seating areas and focal points to take advantage of the most flattering illumination at different times. The ceremony was scheduled for late morning specifically because that's when the rose garden received the perfect combination of direct sunlight and dappled shade from the surrounding trees. The bridesmaids arrived in a coordinated convoy of cars, their laughter and excited chatter adding energy to the gathering. Jessica had chosen her wedding party carefully: her best friend from college, her 2 cousins from my Uncle Frank's family, and Emma, who'd been designated as maid of honor. They moved in a pack, their matching robes flowing as they headed toward the bridal suite I'd had specially prepared in the mansion's master bedroom. The groomsmen trickled in more casually, most of them friends of Marcus who I'd met only briefly at the engagement party. They seemed appropriately impressed by the venue, making the kinds of appreciative comments that men make when they're trying to calculate what something costs without appearing too obvious about it. Marcus himself arrived with his parents, driving a BMW that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. He was a decent guy, from what I could tell, an accountant who seemed genuinely devoted to Jessica and patient with her more dramatic tendencies. His parents were quiet, well-dressed people who smiled politely and seemed slightly overwhelmed by the scale and formality of the whole production. The wedding party immediately began the familiar ritual of pre-ceremony preparation. The photographer started capturing getting-ready shots, the florists made final adjustments to the ceremony decorations, and the caterers began setting up the reception area in the mansion's restored ballroom. I watched it all from my cottage, feeling like an anthropologist observing a culture I belonged to but wasn't quite part of. These were my people, my family, celebrating one of the most important days in their collective history. But I was watching from the outside, literally and figuratively excluded from the joy and connection that filled the air. What struck me most was how naturally they all assumed they belonged there, how easily they moved through spaces I'd created and restored without any awareness that their comfort and enjoyment existed because of work I'd done. They admired the gardens I'd planted, exclaimed over the architecture I'd preserved, and settled into the environment I'd carefully curated, all while maintaining the shared fiction that I was somehow less capable, less successful, less worthy of inclusion than they were. The morning progressed with the smooth efficiency of a well-planned event. The musicians finished their sound check, the officiant arrived and conferred with Jessica about the ceremony details, and guests began taking their seats in the white wooden chairs I'd rented and arranged in perfect rows facing the rose garden altar. From my position at the cottage window, I could see everything. The careful choreography of family members finding their assigned seats, the last-minute adjustments to floral arrangements, the photographer positioning himself to capture the perfect angles of what was about to unfold. But what I couldn't see yet, what none of them could anticipate, was the moment when the officiant would ask his routine question about property permissions, and the careful fiction they'd all constructed about my place in the family would finally, irreversibly, come crashing down. The rehearsal dinner had taken place 3 nights before the wedding at Patricia's house, a sprawling colonial in the suburbs that she'd decorated with the kind of aggressive perfection that spoke of both unlimited budget and unlimited need to impress. I knew about the dinner because Emma had posted 17 Instagram stories from it, each one carefully curated to showcase the elegant table settings, the professional floral arrangements, and the happy faces of family members toasting Jessica and Marcus. I hadn't been invited to that either, of course. The exclusion from the rehearsal dinner had actually hurt more than being left off the wedding guest list, because it was smaller, more intimate, supposedly just for close family and the wedding party. But when Emma's stories showed my second cousins from California sitting at the main table, when I saw my great-aunt Helen raising a champagne glass in a toast, when I watched my parents beaming as they posed for group photos with people I saw, maybe twice a year, the message became crystal clear. It wasn't about space limitations or budget constraints. It was about me not being the kind of family member they wanted to showcase when Jessica's new in-laws were getting their first real impression of our clan. The morning of the wedding, I'd received exactly 1 text message from my family. It came from my mother at 7:43 a.m. "Hope you have a nice day, honey. Thinking of you." No mention of the wedding, no acknowledgement that while I was having my nice day, the rest of the family would be celebrating one of the most significant events in our collective history 50 yards from where I ate my breakfast. Just a generic pleasantry that felt more like a band-aid than genuine concern. I'd stared at that text for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, trying to decide whether to respond. What do you say to someone who's simultaneously acknowledging your existence and your exclusion in the same 5-word message? I'd finally typed back, "Thanks, Mom. Love you too." Because what else was there to say? By 9 a.m., I could hear Patricia's voice carrying across the estate grounds as she directed the setup with military precision. She'd appointed herself the unofficial wedding coordinator, despite Jessica having hired actual professionals to manage the event. But Patricia had never been one to trust important matters to other people, especially when there were appearances to maintain and standards to uphold. "The programs need to be perfectly aligned on each chair," she was saying to one of the venue assistants, "and make sure the ribbon on the aisle runner is completely straight. This photographer is going to be featured in several bridal magazines, so everything needs to be absolutely perfect." I almost laughed at that. Patricia had no idea that the venue assistants she was bossing around were actually my employees, people I'd hired through Cascade Event Solutions to ensure her daughter's wedding went smoothly. The photographer she was worried about impressing had actually shot 3 previous weddings on my property and had specifically requested to book more events here because of how well the estate photographed. Through my cottage windows, I watched the familiar family dynamics play out with the heightened intensity that comes with special occasions. My Uncle Frank had stationed himself near the parking area, ostensibly to help direct traffic, but really to position himself as the first point of contact for arriving guests. Frank had a talent for inserting himself into any situation where he could hold court and share his opinions about business, politics, or whatever topic struck his fancy. I saw him intercept the wedding photographer as she arrived, a talented woman named Maria Santos, who I'd worked with several times before. Frank immediately launched into what I recognized as his standard spiel about the challenges of running a small business, gesturing expansively as he shared unsolicited advice about client management and pricing strategies. Maria nodded politely, clearly trying to extract herself from the conversation so she could do the job she'd been hired for, but Frank seemed oblivious to her growing impatience. This was classic Frank, assuming that his expertise in hardware retail somehow translated to every other industry, and that everyone he met would naturally benefit from his wisdom. The key to success in the service industry, I could hear him saying, is understanding that the customer isn't always right, but they're always the customer. You've got to balance giving them what they want with maintaining your professional standards. Maria made appropriate sounds of agreement while slowly edging toward her equipment bags, probably wondering how a simple wedding photography gig had turned into an impromptu business seminar. I'd seen this exact scene play out at numerous family gatherings, with Frank holding court and dispensing advice to anyone who couldn't politely escape. My parents had positioned themselves near the mansion's front entrance, greeting early arriving guests with the warm hospitality they'd perfected. Over decades of hosting corporate events for my father's Boeing colleagues, Dad wore his meeting important people smile, genuine but slightly formal, the expression of someone who'd spent years navigating office politics and client relationships. Mom had brought her best social skills to the occasion, complimenting guests on their outfits and making small talk about the weather, the beautiful venue, and how excited the family was for Jessica's special day. She had a gift for making people feel welcomed and appreciated, which made her exclusion of me feel even more pointed by contrast. "Isn't this just the most romantic setting you've ever seen?" she gushed to Jessica's college roommate, who'd driven up from San Francisco for the wedding. Our Jessica has such exquisite taste. She found this place completely on her own and booked it 2 years in advance. The planning and coordination she's put into this day, it's just extraordinary. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach hearing Mom attribute the beauty of my property to Jessica's exquisite taste. The gardens they were admiring, the architectural details they were photographing, the carefully maintained grounds that provided the perfect backdrop for their celebration. All of it existed because of my work, my investment, my vision for what this place could become. But in my family's narrative, I was incapable of creating or maintaining anything beautiful. I was the one who lived in a rundown apartment and drove an old car and worked mysterious odd jobs that didn't qualify as real career. The idea that I might be responsible for the elegance surrounding them would have been literally incomprehensible. Emma had arrived early to fulfill her maid of honor duties, and I could see her orchestrating bridesmaids' photos on the mansion's wraparound porch. She'd changed into her wedding day outfit, a flowing lavender dress that complemented Jessica's color scheme perfectly, and she moved through the scene with the confidence of someone who knew she looked good and belonged exactly where she was. "Let's try a few shots with you all sitting on the porch steps," Emma directed the other bridesmaids, automatically taking charge of the photo session despite the professional photographer's presence. "The morning light is hitting the columns beautifully right now, and this angle will show off the architecture behind us." Emma had always had an eye for aesthetics and composition, which had served her well in building her marketing agency. But watching her direct photo shoots on my property, using the restored Victorian details I'd spent years perfecting as props for social media content, felt like a particularly sharp twist of irony. The bridesmaids giggled and posed, their excitement infectious as they celebrated their friend's big day. These were Jessica's closest companions, the women who'd supported her through college and career changes and relationship milestones. They'd been part of every significant moment in her adult life, and their joy felt genuine and deeply connected to their shared history. I found myself wondering what it would feel like to be included in that kind of intimate friendship, to be someone's automatic choice for major celebrations, to belong so naturally to a group that your presence was simply assumed. I'd never had that kind of close-knit social circle, partly because of my military service, and partly because of my tendency toward privacy, but seeing it in action made me aware of what I'd missed. David had taken charge of coordinating the groomsmen, which meant ensuring they all had their boutonnieres properly pinned and understood the processional timing. He approached the task with the same methodical precision he brought to his legal work, checking and double-checking details to prevent any potential problems. "Marcus, your tie is slightly crooked," he said, reaching over to adjust his soon-to-be brother-in-law's formal wear. "And guys, remember that we walk in at exactly 10:45, right after the mothers are seated. The music will cue us, but I want everyone ready to move smoothly." Marcus submitted to David's fussing with good humor, clearly recognizing that resistance was futile when David had decided to manage something. The other groomsmen looked slightly amused by the level of organization being applied to what they probably thought should be a more relaxed process, but they went along with it willingly enough. This was David in his element, solving problems, managing logistics, ensuring that everything happened according to plan. He'd been this way since childhood, the responsible older brother who took charge when parents were busy or situations got complicated. It was a role that had served him well professionally, but it also meant he had strong opinions about how things should be done and limited patience for deviation from his preferred methods. By 10 a.m., the estate was filled with the controlled chaos of final wedding preparations. The caterers were setting up the reception area in the mansion's ballroom. The florists were making last-minute adjustments to centerpieces, and the musicians were running through their processional pieces one final time. I watched Patricia move through it all like a general surveying her troops, stopping to adjust flower arrangements, straighten chair alignments, and offer unsolicited feedback to the various vendors. She'd clearly decided that Jessica's hired professionals needed her supervision to meet family standards, and she wasn't shy about sharing her expectations. "The programs should be placed at a slight angle on each seat," she instructed one of my event staff members. "Not perfectly straight, that looks too rigid, but not random either. There should be intentionality to the placement." The staff member nodded patiently and began adjusting each program according to Patricia's specifications, even though the original placement had been perfectly fine. I'd learned over the years that managing clients like Patricia was an art form that required infinite patience and the ability to make minor adjustments feel like major improvements. What struck me most was how completely comfortable everyone looked in this environment I'd created. They moved through the gardens I'd designed, admired the architectural details I'd restored, and settled into the spaces I'd carefully planned as if they naturally belonged there. There was no awareness that their comfort and enjoyment existed because of work I'd done, investments I'd made, or vision I'd implemented. In their minds, beautiful venues simply existed for people like them to rent for special occasions. The idea that one of their own family members might have created and maintained this level of elegance was literally outside their conceptual framework. I was the family member who couldn't get her life together, so obviously I couldn't be responsible for anything they found impressive or desirable. The painful irony was that everything they were celebrating, Jessica's good taste in venue selection, the exclusivity of the location, the photogenic perfection of every detail, was actually a reflection of my work, my investment, and my commitment to preserving something beautiful. But acknowledging that would have required them to fundamentally reconsider their assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Instead, they maintained the comfortable fiction that I was struggling while they were thriving, that I was somehow less successful or ambitious or capable than the rest of them. It was easier to exclude me from important celebrations than to confront the possibility that their judgments about my life might be incomplete or inaccurate. By 10:30 a.m., guests were taking their seats for the ceremony, and I could see the officiant making his final preparations at the altar. Reverend Mitchell was a kindly man in his 60s who'd performed weddings at my venue several times before. He was thorough, professional, and committed to ensuring that every ceremony he conducted was legally sound and properly documented. What my family didn't know was that Reverend Mitchell was also extremely particular about property permissions and legal requirements. He'd been burned early in his career by conducting a ceremony at a venue that didn't have proper authorization from the property owner. And since then, he'd made it standard practice to verify that all necessary permissions were in place before beginning any wedding service. As I watched him arrange his notes at the makeshift altar, I knew exactly what was coming. In about 15 minutes, he would ask his routine question about property owner permission, and my family's carefully constructed narrative about my place in their lives would finally, irreversibly, begin to unravel. The morning sun climbed higher, casting beautiful light across the rose garden where Jessica would soon promise to love Marcus for the rest of their lives. The setting was perfect, the family was gathered, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. They just had no idea whose plan they were actually following. At 10:35 a.m., I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of watching the ceremony unfold from my cottage window like some kind of family ghost, I was going to attend Jessica's wedding. Not because I'd been invited, I most certainly had not been, but because it was taking place on my property, and I had every right to be there. I chose my outfit carefully, selecting a navy blue wrap dress that I'd bought for corporate events but had never worn to a family gathering. It was elegant without being flashy, professional without being intimidating, and it fit me perfectly in a way that suggested quality rather than trying too hard. I paired it with low heels that would be appropriate for walking on grass and a simple silver necklace that had been my grandmother's. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized how long it had been since I'd dressed up for my own family. For years, I'd defaulted to jeans and casual tops at family gatherings, partly because they were more comfortable, and partly because I'd stopped caring about making visual impressions on people who'd already decided what they thought about me. But today felt different. Today felt like it might matter how I presented myself. I walked out of my cottage and onto the estate grounds with a strange sense of calm settling over me. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the sound of gentle conversation and classical music from the ceremony area. Guests were seated in neat rows facing the rose garden altar, and I could see the wedding party making final preparations near the mansion's side entrance. My first challenge was simply walking across my own property without being noticed by family members who would immediately question my presence. I chose a path that took me along the edge of the gardens, using the mature oak trees and carefully placed landscaping to provide natural cover as I made my way toward the ceremony area. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially sneaking around my own estate to avoid confrontation with people who had no idea they were celebrating on land I owned. But I wasn't ready for the revelation yet. I wanted to witness their joy, their assumptions, their comfortable certainty about how the world worked, before that certainty got shattered. I found a spot near the back of the seating area, partially hidden behind a large hydrangea bush that I'd planted 2 seasons ago. From there, I had a clear view of the ceremony, but remained relatively inconspicuous to the other guests. A few people glanced my way, but no one seemed to recognize me or question my presence. The wedding party had assembled near the mansion's entrance, and I could see Jessica in her stunning white gown, her face glowing with the particular radiance that comes with being the center of everyone's attention on the most important day of your life. She looked genuinely beautiful, and despite everything that had transpired between us, I felt a surge of affection for my cousin. Emma was fussing with Jessica's train, making sure every fold fell perfectly for the photographers who were capturing these precious pre-ceremony moments. David was lining up the groomsmen, checking their boutonnieres one final time and reminding them about the processional timing. Marcus stood slightly apart from the group, clearly nervous but trying to maintain his composure. My parents had taken their seats in the front row, Mom dabbing at her eyes with a tissue even though the ceremony hadn't started yet. Dad sat with his arm around her shoulders, both of them beaming with the pride that comes from watching a beloved family member reach a major life milestone. Patricia and Frank were seated in the second row, Patricia still making subtle adjustments to her outfit and hair, ensuring she looked perfect for all the photos that would commemorate this day. Frank was chatting with Marcus's father, probably sharing business insights or commenting on the stock market or offering opinions about the local real estate market. The classical trio began playing the processional music, and the ceremony officially began. The groomsmen walked down the aisle with measured steps, each one taking their position at the altar with varying degrees of nervousness and formality. David walked with military precision, while Marcus's college friends looked like they were trying not to trip over their own feet. Then came the bridesmaids, each one radiant in their lavender dresses, walking carefully on the grass in their high heels. Emma brought up the rear as maid of honor, carrying herself with the poise of someone who knew she looked spectacular and was comfortable being photographed from every angle. Finally, Jessica appeared at the top of the aisle, escorted by my uncle, Frank, who'd been given the honor of giving her away since her own father had passed away 5 years earlier. She moved with the grace of someone who'd practiced this walk a dozen times, her eyes fixed on Marcus with a smile that could have powered the entire estate. As they reached the altar, Reverend Mitchell welcomed everyone with his warm, practiced voice. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Jessica Marie Patterson and Marcus David Thompson in the bonds of holy matrimony." I found myself genuinely moved by the ceremony, despite my complicated feelings about my exclusion from it. There was something universal about watching two people promise to love each other for the rest of their lives, something that transcended family politics and personal grievances. Jessica and Marcus exchanged vows they'd written themselves, speaking about partnership and growth and building a future together. Their words were heartfelt and personal, reflecting the genuine connection they'd developed over their 3 years together. Whatever else was happening in my family dynamics, this was a real love story unfolding in front of us. The ring exchange went smoothly, with Tyler serving as ring bearer and managing not to drop either band despite his obvious nervousness. The congregation laughed when he whispered, "I did it," after successfully completing his part, and the moment of levity seemed to relax everyone. But then came the part of the ceremony I'd been unconsciously anticipating. The moment when Reverend Mitchell would ask his standard legal question about property permissions. I'd seen him conduct enough ceremonies on my estate to know his routine, and I knew he was extremely thorough about ensuring all legal requirements were met. "Before we proceed to the final blessing," Reverend Mitchell said, his voice carrying clearly across the seated guests, "I need to address one administrative matter that's required by state law for ceremonies conducted on private property." I felt my pulse quicken, though I maintained my outward composure. This was it, the moment when my family's comfortable assumptions would begin to unravel. The state of Washington requires explicit permission from the property owner for wedding ceremonies conducted on private estates, the Reverend continued, his tone professional but slightly apologetic for the interruption. "I have documentation from the management company, but I need to confirm that the actual property owner has given consent for today's ceremony." A slight murmur went through the assembled guests, most of whom had probably never considered the legal complexities of wedding venue permissions. Jessica and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected requirement. Patricia immediately stood up, her protective instincts activated by any threat to her daughter's perfect day. "I'm sure Jessica has handled all the necessary paperwork," she announced with the authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through sheer force of will. The venue coordinator assured us that everything was properly arranged. "I understand, ma'am," Reverend Mitchell replied patiently. "But I need to hear directly from the property owner or their designated representative. It's a legal requirement I can't waive, regardless of what the management company has told you." Jessica's face was beginning to show signs of panic, the kind of expression that appears when a carefully planned event encounters an unexpected obstacle. "But we paid all the fees," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "We have contracts and receipts and everything the venue coordinator said we needed." The contracts are with the management company, Reverend Mitchell explained, gently. But this property is privately owned. I need explicit consent from the owner before I can legally perform this ceremony. The murmur from the guests grew louder, with people starting to turn in their seats and exchange concerned glances. This was clearly not part of anyone's anticipated wedding experience, and the uncertainty was beginning to create genuine anxiety among the assembled family and friends. David immediately stood up and moved toward the altar, his legal training kicking in as he tried to assess and solve the problem. Reverend, what exactly do you need? Can we contact the property owner by phone? Is there some kind of written authorization that would satisfy the legal requirement? The owner would need to be physically present to give consent, Reverend Mitchell replied, or they would need to have provided written authorization specifically for today's ceremony. The documentation I have from the management company isn't sufficient. I could see the panic spreading through my family as they realized their perfect wedding might be legally impossible to complete. Jessica looked like she might cry. Marcus was running his hands through his hair in frustration, and Patricia was moving into full crisis management mode. This is ridiculous, Patricia declared, her voice rising with indignation. We've spent thousands of dollars on this venue. We have 100 guests here. We've hired photographers and caterers and musicians. There has to be some way to resolve this. Frank had joined David near the altar, both of them trying to problem-solve their way out of the situation, with the kind of masculine confidence that assumes every obstacle can be overcome through proper application of logic and determination. Can we get the property owner on the phone? Frank asked. Surely they can give verbal consent that would satisfy the legal requirement. I'm afraid not, Reverend Mitchell said apologetically. The law is quite specific about this. I've been conducting weddings for 25 years, and I've learned not to take chances with legal requirements. That's when I realized the moment had arrived. Not the moment I'd been planning or anticipating, but the moment when I could no longer remain invisible on my own property while my family's celebration hung in the balance. I stood up from my seat, behind the hydrangea bush, smoothed down my navy dress, and began walking toward the altar with the same calm composure I'd maintained throughout this entire surreal morning. Every head turned as I approached, family members registering surprise, confusion, and in some cases irritation at my unexpected appearance at the wedding I hadn't been invited to attend. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering, "but I believe I can help resolve this situation." As I walked toward the altar with every pair of eyes fixed on me, I could see the exact moment when my family's confusion shifted into something closer to mortification. Here I was, the uninvited family disappointment, somehow inserting myself into Jessica's perfect wedding ceremony at the most critical possible moment. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so loaded with years of accumulated tension. First, surprise. What was I doing here? Then embarrassment. How dare I show up uninvited? Then anger. This was exactly the kind of inappropriate behavior she'd expected from me. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, her voice pitched, low but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent gathering. "This is a private ceremony." Emma had stepped forward from the bridesmaids' lineup, her maid of honor instincts apparently extending to damage control when family drama threatened to derail the proceedings. "Sarah, maybe this isn't the best time," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound caring rather than accusatory, though I could see the tension in her shoulders. David was already moving toward me, probably planning to physically escort me away from the ceremony before I could cause further disruption. His expression combined lawyer-like assessment with big brother protectiveness, trying to solve what he clearly saw as a problem that needed immediate management. But I held up one hand in a gesture that somehow stopped him mid-stride, and I addressed Reverend Mitchell directly, ignoring the growing murmur of confusion and concern from the assembled guests. "Reverend Mitchell," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I'm Sarah Chen, and I'm the property owner you're looking for." The silence that followed my words was so complete that I could hear the wind moving through the oak trees and the distant sound of the creek flowing over stones. It was the kind of silence that happens when people's brains are trying to process information that doesn't fit with their existing understanding of reality. Jessica was the first to break the silence, her voice cracking slightly with strain. "That's impossible. Sarah lives in some rundown apartment and drives that old Honda. She doesn't own property like this." Patricia immediately stepped forward, her protective instincts fully activated now that she perceived a threat to her daughters. "Wedding day. Sarah, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is not the time for your attention-seeking behavior. We have a wedding to complete." But Reverend Mitchell was looking at me with recognition dawning in his eyes. "Ms. Chen," he said, slowly, "are you telling me that you are the owner of Riverside Gardens estate?" "I am," I replied simply, reaching into my purse to pull out the folder I'd brought with me, the one containing the property deed, tax documents, and business licenses that proved my ownership beyond any doubt. "I have all the documentation you need right here." The murmur from the guests grew louder as people tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Family members were turning to each other with expressions of confusion, while Jessica's friends and Marcus's family watched this unexpected family drama unfold with the fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's personal chaos. Frank immediately moved closer, his business owner instincts telling him to verify what sounded like an impossible claim. "Sarah, what are you talking about? You can't possibly own this place. Do you have any idea what a property like this is worth?" "About $3.7 million, I replied calmly, "which is what I paid for it in 2021, plus approximately another $1 million in restoration and improvement costs over the past 3 years. The number hit the assembled family like a physical blow. I could see them trying to process the mathematical impossibility of their family failure, somehow having access to nearly $5 million in property investment money. Mom had gone completely pale, one hand pressed to her chest as if she were having trouble breathing. "Sarah, honey, I don't understand. How could you afford something like this? Where would you get that kind of money?" David was staring at the documents in my hand, with the intense focus of someone whose legal training was telling him to verify claims before accepting them as fact. "Can I see those papers?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I handed him the folder, watching his expression change as he examined the deed, the property tax records, and the business incorporation documents for Riverside Gardens LLC, all of which clearly showed my name and signature. "These look legitimate," he said slowly, his voice carrying the disbelief that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly overturned. "But Sarah, I don't understand how this is possible. What do you do for work? How do you have this kind of money?" That's when I realized the moment had come to reveal not just the property ownership, but the entire career and life I'd been building while they all assumed I was struggling to make ends meet. "I'm a defense contractor," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "I specialize in cybersecurity consulting for military and government clients. I've been running my own firm since 2019. The silence stretched even longer this time, broken only by the sound of someone's phone buzzing and the distant laughter of children playing in a neighboring property. Emma was the first to find her voice. "You're a defense contractor? Sarah, that's impossible. You live in that tiny apartment and drive that old car. You never talk about work. You never—" She stopped mid-sentence, probably realizing that her assumptions about my lifestyle choices were suddenly open to reinterpretation. "I live in the caretaker's cottage on this property," I corrected gently, "which I restored along with the main house, and I drive an old car because I prefer not to draw attention to myself or my financial situation." The weight of my family's stares was almost tangible as they tried to reconcile the Sarah they thought they knew with the woman standing before them, holding property deeds worth nearly $5 million. I could see the mental calculations happening behind their eyes, The desperate attempt to make sense of information that fundamentally challenged everything they'd believed about me for the past 8 years. I think, I said quietly, it's time I told you the real story of what I've been doing since I came back from Afghanistan. Reverend Mitchell, bless him, seemed to understand that this family revelation needed to happen before the wedding could continue. He stepped back slightly, giving us space while maintaining his professional composure, though I could see the curiosity in his eyes about how this unexpected drama would resolve itself. When I was discharged from the Army in 2016, I began, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of explaining my life to people who should have known it already. I had skills that most civilians never develop: advanced cybersecurity training, network penetration testing, digital forensics, classified system security protocols. The military had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in my technical education. Patricia was shaking her head slowly, as if she could somehow refuse to accept what she was hearing. But you never talked about any of that. You never mentioned cybersecurity or consulting or... Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you all dismissed it, I interrupted, my tone still calm but carrying an edge of years accumulated frustration. Do you remember Christmas dinner 2018 when I tried to explain that I was working on security assessments for government contractors? Uncle Frank laughed and said I was probably just fixing people's computers. When I mentioned that I was developing cybersecurity protocols, Mom patted my hand and said it was nice that I was keeping busy with computer stuff. The memory of that particular evening was crystal clear in my mind. I'd been excited about a major contract I'd just signed, a 6-month project that would pay more than most people made in 2 years. But when I'd tried to share my success, the family had either ignored me or reduced my achievements to something they could understand and dismiss. I learned pretty quickly that you all had a story about who I was, the struggling veteran who couldn't figure out civilian life, and you weren't interested in information that contradicted that narrative. So I stopped trying to correct it. David was still holding my property documents, his legal mind clearly struggling to integrate this new information with his existing assumptions about his sister's life. Sarah, cybersecurity consulting for government contracts. That's serious. Money. Why would you let us think you were struggling financially? Because you all seemed so invested in that version of me, I replied. And honestly, it was easier than dealing with the weird family dynamics that would have come with you, knowing I was more successful than some of you. Emma's face had gone through several color changes as she processed this information, and I could see her running through years of family interactions with this new context. The apartment you live in, you said it's the caretaker's cottage? I restored it completely. Hardwood floors, stone fireplace, gourmet kitchen, full office setup for my consulting work. It's about 200 square feet of beautifully appointed living space that I designed exactly the way I wanted it. I gestured toward the cottage, which was visible through the trees about 100 yards away. You all assumed it was run down because it's small, and because you never bothered to actually look at it or ask to see inside. The truth was, my cottage was featured in Architectural Digest last year as an example of successful small space design, though the article had used my business alias and hadn't mentioned that it was part of a larger estate restoration project. But I didn't mention that detail. There were already enough revelations for one day. Frank was studying the mansion behind us with new eyes, probably trying to calculate the scope of the restoration work and the level of expertise required to execute it properly. Sarah, this kind of historical renovation, the craftsmanship, the attention to period details, this represents serious knowledge and significant financial investment. I spent 2 years researching Victorian-era construction techniques and materials, I said. I consulted with historical preservation specialists, hired master craftsmen who understood authentic restoration methods, and sourced period-appropriate fixtures and furnishings from antique dealers across the country. What I didn't mention was that the restoration project had become something of a passion for me, a way to channel the same attention to detail and systematic thinking that made me successful in cybersecurity work. Every room in the mansion had been carefully researched and restored according to historical accuracy standards, and the project had earned recognition from the State Historical Preservation Society. Mom finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. Honey, when you said you were doing consulting work, I thought you meant small jobs, maybe helping local businesses with their computer problems. I never imagined that I was conducting security assessments for defense contractors. I finished. That I was developing cybersecurity protocols for military installations. That I was making more money than Dad did in his best year at Boeing. The comparison to Dad's Boeing salary was perhaps unfair, but it drove home the point about the assumptions they'd made about my capabilities and achievements. Dad himself looked like he'd been physically struck, probably realizing for the first time that his dismissive comments about my little computer business had been directed at someone whose annual income exceeded his own by a significant margin. My consulting firm has contracts with 3 different branches of the military, I continued. I've done security assessments for installations across the Pacific Northwest, developed cybersecurity training protocols that are being used at bases nationwide, and designed secure communication systems for classified operations. Jessica had been silent through most of this revelation, her wedding day joy temporarily overshadowed by the realization that her excluded cousin was actually the property owner making her dream wedding possible. Sarah, I don't understand why you didn't tell us. Why would you let us think? Because every single time I tried to share something positive about my life, it got dismissed or minimized or turned into advice about how I should be more ambitious, I said. It was easier to let you all believe what you wanted to believe than to keep fighting for recognition I didn't actually need. The assembled wedding guests were watching this family drama unfold with the fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's deeply personal revelations. I could see Jessica's college friends exchanging glances, Marcus's family looking uncomfortable with the level of family dysfunction on display, and various relatives trying to figure out how this new information changed their understanding of family dynamics. Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat gently, reminding us all that we were in the middle of a wedding ceremony that still needed to be completed. Ms. Chen, do I have your permission as the property owner to conduct this wedding ceremony on your estate? Of course, I said immediately, turning to Jessica with what I hoped was a genuine smile. Jessica, this is your wedding day, and it should be perfect. You have my complete permission to celebrate your marriage here. But Jessica was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part confusion, part something that might have been guilt. Sarah, you own this place, this whole beautiful estate, everything we've been admiring and photographing and celebrating. You created all of this. I restored it, I corrected. The bones were here when I bought it, but yes, I've spent 3 years bringing it back to life. Patricia was still struggling to accept this new reality, her protective instincts for her daughter warring with her dawning understanding of how wrong she'd been about me. But if you own this place, why didn't you just offer it to Jessica for the wedding? Why did she have to go through the management company and pay all those fees? Because, I said quietly, I wasn't invited to the wedding. It seemed strange to offer my property for a celebration I wasn't welcome to attend. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked silences. This one carried the weight of guilt and recognition, the uncomfortable awareness that their treatment of me had been not just unfair, but actively harmful to someone who had actually been in a position to help them all along. Emma was the first to break, tears starting to stream down her face as the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. Oh my God, Sarah, we've been so awful to you. And you could have, all this time, you could have... I could. Have what? I asked gently. Proved that you were wrong about me? Forced you to acknowledge my success? Made you feel bad about your assumptions? David was shaking his head slowly, probably running through years of family interactions with this new context and realizing how many opportunities he'd missed to actually get to know his sister. Sarah, I'm so sorry. We all are. We had no idea. You had no idea because you never asked, I said simply. You decided who I was and what I was capable of, and you never bothered to check whether your assumptions matched reality. And that, really, was the heart of it. They'd created a story about me that served their need to feel superior, successful, and justified in their life choices. The struggling veteran sister made their own achievements feel more significant by comparison. But that story had never been true, and maintaining it had cost all of us years of authentic relationship. Reverend Mitchell stepped forward again, his professional instincts telling him to guide us back toward the wedding ceremony that had brought us all together. Ms. Chen, thank you for clarifying the property permission. Now, shall we continue with Jessica and Marcus's wedding? I nodded and started to step back, planning to return to my seat behind the hydrangea bush and let the ceremony proceed. But Jessica's voice stopped me. Sarah, wait. She turned to face me fully, her wedding dress rustling as she moved. I can't get married on your property while you're sitting in the back like an uninvited guest. You belong here with the family. The invitation in her voice was genuine, carrying both apology and recognition. But I could see the uncertainty in my parents' faces, the discomfort in Patricia's posture, the complex emotions playing across David's and Emma's expressions. Thank you, I said quietly, but I think I'll stay where I am. This is your day, Jessica. Let's make sure it's perfect. And with that, I walked back to my seat behind the hydrangea bush, leaving my family to process what they'd learned while Reverend Mitchell continued with the ceremony that would join Jessica and Marcus in marriage on the property I owned, surrounded by gardens I'd planted, in celebration of love that transcended the complicated dynamics of family relationships. If you've ever been the family member who got underestimated, dismissed, or excluded from important moments because people decided who you were without bothering to learn the truth, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who don't make noise about their achievements, are building something incredible while everyone else is busy making assumptions. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when those assumptions finally crumble.